Okay, here we are picking up on part two, where I'm going to talk about the civil rights movement, the world in which, and the sort of intellectual and artistic climate and political climate in which Ntozake Shange is writing for colored girls. So, two different approaches to the civil rights movement. Again, there is no possible way to talk about the detail and the nuance of the two guys I'm going to talk about. I'm talking about them in a general way. I will throw in complexities all over the place here because history is a deeply complicated thing, right? First, I'm going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. You've heard of MLK. There's a reason you've heard of MLK more than you've heard of the next guy, Malcolm X, right? Because history, and white people especially, are really comfortable with his integrationist ideas and his peaceful protests, right? And the notion that he believed in, that second bullet point is really important, right? Empowerment through inclusion. And that's kind of that catchphrase, that touchstone line from his famous speech, right? That our children would be considered not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, that line gets overused, that speech gets overused because King was actually kind of a radical. Like, he was fairly communist. The FBI was after him for his theoretically communist leanings, which, I mean, he wasn't like trying to get the Soviet Union into America, but this was still big time Red Scare time, right? So the guy had some pretty radical ideas. History has digested him into this more straightforward version, right? So when you read the play, where does our playwright address issues which quote unquote transcend race? Not that there is or isn't an issue that can or can't transcend race. That's a really tricky conversation. But there are certain things about this play that all viewers, perhaps all women, perhaps all female identifying folks could could relate to. And that's one of the things that, to a degree, MLK was interested in doing, was bridging a gap between black audiences, black lives, black politics, and white folks. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got Malcolm X and the Black Power movement, right? These are two different groups that took a more separationist approach. And again, thinking about Malcolm X especially, a lot of this radicalism faded over the course of his life. But we need to talk about the fundamental ideas of empowerment through separation. And the idea there, which is still present today and a completely valid idea, which was, hey, I hear the call for integration, but what are you asking me to integrate with? And what am I going to lose if I do that? And question number one, Malcolm X's answer, the Black Power movement's answer is, you're asking me to integrate into a fundamentally racist society. And question two is answered as, and if I do that, I will lose. The only way I'll be able to get into that society is if I put aside some of my blackness. And so those ideas led to, like, you know what? I don't even want to be in that society, right? Let's be separate. This is by, for, and about black people, whether it's an artistic movement or a political movement or whatever. The goal here, and again, not that Martin Luther King didn't do this, he certainly did, but there's a more of a stress on foregrounding white supremacy and not saying things like, well, we just want to be included, but saying, like, there is a fundamental white supremacy to this culture. I don't even know if we want in. Here's a nice quote from Malcolm X, and there's no way this quote is not about Martin Luther King. Just as the slave master of that day used Tom, the house Negro, to keep the field Negroes in check, the same old slave master today has Negroes who are nothing but modern Uncle Toms, 20th century Uncle Toms, to keep you and me in check, keep us under control, keep us passive and peaceful and nonviolent. That's Tom making you nonviolent. Now, MLK and Malcolm X actually weren't as opposed as history has made them, and weren't as opposed as this quote would suggest. Malcolm X was a radical, though. He said a lot of really radical things, like this one, right, that are in a large collection of complicated quotes that make up his complicated life. And he was a radical guy. And I mean, it's hard to blame anyone during this era for saying stuff like that, right? Or taking up arms, as you see the black folks in the behind the quote doing, right? Those guys, by the way, that's essentially a Second Amendment protest. The guys with shotguns standing in the courthouse are essentially like, hey, America, you like your Second Amendment. Are you okay with black people exercising their Second Amendment? Oh, does this make you uncomfortable? Right? There's a really nice sort of, again, not all the way to aggressive, but progressive, unapologetic approach to their political things, right? So What do we think? What do we think about the MLK approach? What do we think about the Malcolm X approach? And again, I'll put the asterisk in there. Those two guys were much more nuanced and much more similar than history has allowed them to be. So when you read the play, in what ways is this play specifically by, for, and about Black audiences? Okay, let's talk for a minute about Leroy Jones, a guy named Leroy Jones who changed his name to Amiri Baraka, as you've probably heard before. Many Black people in this era and continuing forward changed their names because Jones, this guy, was almost certainly his original birth last name was the last name of his ancestors' slave owners, right? Because in being brought from Africa to America, that connection to lineage and family and name was completely erased. So, like a lot of folks, Muhammad Ali did this, Malcolm X, obviously, right? Amiri Baraka changed his name from Leroy Jones to Amiri Baraka. He writes a play in 1964 called Dutchman. I believe you all are familiar with this play because we did it recently, but just in case not. Really good play, rough. Black man walks onto a train full of white people. The whole play takes place on the train. A white woman flirts with him, messes with his head, goes back and forth. They argue. She ends up stabbing him in the chest, throwing his body off the train. That's it. That's the end of the play. Oh, sorry, the play's not over. The door's closed, the door's open, and another Black man gets on the train. This is a pretty radical thinker and a pretty radical play. So you read Manifesto on the Revolutionary Theater from the digital reading packet. What are your thoughts on that, right? That manifesto and the Black Arts Movement essay essentially advocate for theater that will unapologetically tell Black stories. The Black Arts Movement envisions an art that speaks directly to the needs and aspirations of Black America. In order to perform this task, the movement proposes a radical reordering of the Western cultural aesthetic. Now, just pause right there. Western cultural aesthetic. Think about how many of the myths and fairy tales and big ideas you know come from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, European fairy tales, right? Like everything Disney did up to a certain point was from some kind of European fairy tale, right? So think about, and even Shakespeare, right? Even that is right? So that is that Western cultural aesthetic. What Baraka is saying here is, we got to find for Black people to define the world in their own terms. The Black artist's primary duty is to speak to the spiritual and cultural needs of the Black people, not just in the story, but how the story is told. So there's a radically different aesthetic for colored girls than there is even for Raisin in the Sun, right? This is a deliberately anti-realistic play that is complex in a variety of ways. Shange loves Baraka. She thought a lot about him and thought, you know what, for colored girls should depart from a Western cultural aesthetic. How's she breaking new ground in terms of performance and what performance is and what can be? So let's talk briefly about Shange. The collective effort, and what I'm talking about here is kind of where she came from as a playwright, was that of 20 to 30 feminist writers in the San Francisco Bay Area to remedy and explain, explicate, and extrapolate our situation as women. This is a quote from Shange talking about where she's coming from and who she was. That was the collective effort. The work itself is individual. The stamina and the courage, if there is courage involved in it, to tackle issues that might be painful or unattractive comes from that collective effort. But the work itself is individual. List of folks right there. We were a collection, Black, Asian, and Native American women working at the same time. So the idea for this play comes from not just Shange's Black experience, but her dialogue and working with other women from marginalized groups, right? We read our works at the same readings. For the most part, they were about our own experiences. We gave each other the strength and the environment to do that. So I want you to think about in this play, as you go through it, how this play talks about the sharing of stories to create strength. Jones, a little more interested in Black masculinity, right? Baraka, he's interested in what it means to be a Black man. Shange has some disagreements with the Black Arts Movement, right? So there's an interest here in Shange looking at Baraka. He kind of looked at her and said, look, why do you got to write this play that's dragging on Black men? We need to lift Black men up. And she said, I get that, but I got to tell the real story about what we've been through, right? And we're also working on this big idea of like how dramatic forms can change to incorporate new forms, right? what ways can the Black Arts Movement, and this is again Shange, her idea saying, how can we bring in color? How can we bring in sound and music? How can we open up the structure of traditional theater going forward? And what you see right here is top two bullets, right? Baraka embracing Black masculinity. Bottom four bullets, Shange saying, well, what if we did some different things? What if we did something like what you see in For Colored Girls, right? What she's looking for is a more artistic intervention from a director. If you're going to direct For Colored Girls, it demands a vision, right, and an idea. So keep that one in mind too, as an abstraction kind of, and think about these things as you read the play. I look forward to hearing your comments in the discussion document.